Not that long ago, the air cargo industry was booming, but right now it seems to suddenly be in a very dramatic downturn. So why is that? Obviously the pandemic rush is over, but it turns out that there is actually way more behind it than that. Stay tuned. "2020 was obviously a horrible year for the airline industry. I'm sure you remember the TV images of rows and rows of passenger jets just sitting still on airports all over the world. And maybe, at some point, you also saw pictures of passenger aircraft being used as makeshift freighters or preighters filled with boxes of cargo strapped into the passenger cabin instead of passengers. Now, in the beginning, these jets were carrying PPE and other key equipment, but that's not all they ended up carrying. Someone had to carry all of the stuff that bored people from all over the world was buying online, so for much of 2020, in many parts of the world, the only aircraft still flying were actually freighters. Back in those days, a lot of pilots were furloughed or simply lost their jobs altogether, and because of that, airlines obviously also stopped most of the hiring they were doing, as well as any flight training that they might have been involved in, something that obviously hit a lot of aspiring new pilots hard. So this was a difficult time for many of us passenger pilots, but for cargo pilots who were still flying, things were challenging in a very different way. Because cargo operators were busy. And I mean really busy. And it turns out that the reason wasn't just because of PPE and other medical equipment or online shopping. No, the air freight industry was actually put in some serious unbalance during that time, more than most people understand, and the reasons turns out to be quite a few. Firstly, something that is very easy to forget is that about half the cargo capacity of the airline industry actually comes from the cargo holds of passenger airliners. And that meant that when the world's passenger jets suddenly were grounded, about half of the world's air cargo capacity disappeared literally overnight. But in reality, it was actually way worse than that, because not all freight is fit to travel in all kinds of aircraft. There is some cargo that, for safety reasons, isn't allowed in big quantities on board passenger aircraft, and an example of that is pallets full of brand new mobile phones, tablets, power tools and other devices that holds lithium batteries. Products containing lithium-ion batteries are considered dangerous goods and need to travel in aircraft with additional fire protection standards, which means dedicated freighters. So that meant that even passenger jets who were temporarily flying cargo around couldn't carry some of these goods. The other thing that is worth remembering here is that the air cargo industry doesn't operate in a vacuum. The pandemic didn't just hit air cargo capacity, it also completely disorganized global sea shipping, which is how the vast majority of all shipping is normally handled over the world. The problems for the shipping industry was largely caused by pandemic-era travel restrictions, especially in the early days, who made it nearly impossible for ships and crews to get in and out of many important commercial ports. Those travel requirements also kept changing from place to place and day to day as the pandemic escalated, making the issues worse and worse as the time went by. Now, eventually, allowances were made for vital cargo at key ports, but even that turned out to be easier said than done, since not everyone agreed on what was considered vital cargo. Anyway, long story short, shipping prices absolutely skyrocketed as a result of this. Now, how much they actually increased really depends on which ports and which route we are talking about, but in many cases they doubled, trebled or even quadrupled. And crucially for this story, these prices increased more as a percentage on normal freight than air freight did. Now, air cargo obviously remained more expensive than other cargo, but suddenly the rates on some goods got close enough to make air cargo viable for things like clothes that normally would never see the inside of a cargo aircraft. And this obviously increased the demand even further. So that, in combination with the effective loss of about half of the air cargo capacity, eventually caused air freight prices to almost triple as well. In 2019, transporting a kilogram of cargo by air cost somewhere between $1.6 to $1.8 US. But in April of 2020, that cost rose to over $4, and this wasn't even the maximum. Now, It's worth remembering here that this increase would have been even higher if it wasn't for the fact that the jet fuel prices dropped by over 50% at the same time due to plummeting oil demand. The fuel price issue is easy to overlook, and in fact it remained quite important even during the following years. For example, fluctuations in the oil price explain why the air cargo rates remained high during 2020 and 2021, peaking at almost $5 per kilo in December as the fuel prices started normalizing. The prices should then have dropped a bit more than they did in 2022, but then Russia's escalation of the war in Ukraine bumped the oil prices up again, keeping cargo rates high. Now obviously, everyone knew that this situation would not go on forever, and as soon as the passenger airlines started to recover, the cargo industry would start to normalize. But that's not exactly how it worked out. Because passenger travel actually started picking up well before where we are now in 2023. I'm sure you all remember the travel chaos that erupted in the summer of 2022 when millions of travel-hungry people completely overwhelmed the underprepared airports and airlines. So, if the return of passenger aviation and with that the extra cargo capacity came back already last year, then why would there be an air cargo downturn now? Why didn't it happen earlier? Well, the thing is that not all passenger travel recovered in the same way, and on top of that, there were more changes in the air freight industry that had already started before 2020, which are going to turn out to be really important here. And those changes, together with the end of the pandemic, are the factors that are now creating a perfect storm for the air freight industry. And I will explain exactly what these changes were and how this will affect the freighters and their pilots after this. Now, since we're talking about the air cargo industry and the huge impact that e-commerce will have on it, it immediately brings up the importance of cybersecurity. You really need to be careful these days when you're out shopping or doing anything online really, and this is where today's sponsor, NordVPN, comes in. NordVPN is a fantastic, fast and secure VPN which can help you access content from all over the world at a click of a button, but it also comes with powerful security tools like threat protection, ad blocker, and a tool that will scan files for malware before you download them. This means that Nord will help you to access your favorite content from wherever you are, surf the web in a safe, fast and secure way, and also keep you anonymous when you do so. We use Nord to help unblock geo-blocked articles for our research, which is super helpful, and if you want to try it for yourself, then just use the link here in the description below, which is nordvpn.com/mentor now to get 4 free months when you sign up for a 2-year deal. And remember, Nord always gives you a full 30-day money-back guarantee so you don't risk anything. Thank you, Nord. Now let's continue. Alright, first of all, let's explain why the recovery in passenger travel is hitting the air cargo industry now and not earlier. This actually has mostly to do with where shippers need to ship their cargo from. It is certainly true that most passenger air travel recovered significantly already back in 2022. But the type of air travel most relevant to those shippers out there is long-haul travel, and the long-haul passenger recovery lagged significantly behind that of short and medium haul. And on top of that, the specific value of long-haul flights for the shippers depended largely on the demand for freight on each individual route, with many of the higher demand routes going between Asia and North America or Asia and Europe. A lot of countries in Asia had very strict travel restrictions until relatively recently, late in 2022 or even early 2023. And that meant that the leisure travelers to those destinations had other places they could go to on holiday, and many of them waited a few more months to make sure that these restrictions wouldn't come back. So, with little to no increase in passenger traffic on those key routes, it meant that the passenger cargo capacity also didn't come back as fast as the shippers would have wanted to, and that also kept the air cargo prices high. But now those travelers are coming back, and we can clearly see this in the way that air cargo rates have progressed in 2022 and so far in 2023. After the peak of nearly $5 per kilo in late 2021, cargo rates fell progressively to just over $3 by the end of 2022. And in 2023, the price has continued to decrease to about $2.3 per kilo in August, which is the latest data that we have, meaning a drop of 35% compared to the same time the year before. Now, these prices are expected to go up a bit towards the end of the year, as it does every single year when we get closer to December with its Christmas shopping, but they will still be significantly lower than last year's air cargo rates. The simple fact is that the demand is now lower, both because of the increase in available cargo capacity and the fact that we're all shopping way less than we did back during the pandemic. Now, air cargo rates are still higher than they were before the pandemic back in 2019, around 60 cents per kilo higher, which is a lot, and the main reason for this seems to be the higher price of fuel as well as some other increased costs. But since these costs are also hitting the cargo operators and not just the consumers, this overall rate reduction that we've seen has created some real havoc in the aviation cargo industry that had probably gotten quite used to those nice high rates during the pandemic. In August, Western Global Airlines entered Chapter 11 bankruptcy proceedings, and that's even though they had recently taken on some military contracts to try and stave off the crisis. But perhaps the most obvious problem the air cargo industry is facing right now is just simply overcapacity. Like I mentioned before the break, even before the pandemic, there had been some changes started in the industry. A lot of cargo airlines had been looking for ways to renew their fleets back then, replacing some of their older types like the DC-10s and the MD-11s and even the older 747s. The higher revenues that many of these cargo airlines enjoyed during the pandemic led many of them to also accelerate these fleet replacements, which drove demand up for both brand new jets and for cargo conversions of passenger airliners. You might remember that some passenger airlines accelerated the retirement of a lot of their older aircraft during 2020, and in the case of less efficient jets like the 4-engine 747s, this sadly meant that most of them just went straight to the scrap heap. But many other types, like the 767s and some 777s, instead went into long-term storage or straight into freighter conversions. And for some, like the Airbus A330, the timing of these early retirements actually had some really interesting implications. Firstly, some airlines were in the process of picking up new A330neo, so their older A330-300s and 200s were up for grabs for anyone who wanted them. And secondly, Airbus and Singapore's ST Aerospace in the end of 2017 certified the A330 P2F, which stands for Passenger to Freighter Conversion. The timing of the introduction of this conversion helped the airlines and lessors who own these jets to get some extra value out of them, just as the newer A330neo was coming into service. As it turns out, creating a brand new second-hand role for older jets to convince airlines to buy new ones instead was a really popular idea. Boeing also introduced a freighter conversion of its 737-800 just before the pandemic, and that just happened as the 737 MAX first entered service. And it wasn't just Boeing and Airbus that could smell a great deal here. AIA in Israel also started to work on a freighter conversion of the Boeing 777ER, with an eye to convert jets that the airlines would likely replace with the 777X, or with a larger version of the Airbus A350. Anyway, the point that I'm trying to get to here is that the preparations for all of these new conversions actually started well before 2020. So when the skyrocketing demand for air cargo came during the pandemic, these conversion companies suddenly had their phones ringing off the hooks thanks to people who were looking for converted freighters as fast as humanly possible. As a response to this, conversion companies and contractors went all hands on deck. They doubled and then redoubled their conversion capacity, and even though they did that, they still couldn't keep up with the demand. In late 2022, if you called a conversion center up and said that you had a 737-800 that you wanted to turn into a freighter, you would be placed in a 2-year waiting list. But of course now, after the drop in demand and several cancellations, the same conversion company could likely accommodate a last-minute request for a conversion if you would need one. But the fact here is that nobody is converting any 737-800s right now. And that, on the other hand, has not only to do with the overcapacity that I just talked about, it is also because suddenly there are no spare 737-800s available out there at all. And here we get to the next piece in this complicated puzzle. Like I just said, a big reason why manufacturers like Boeing and Airbus would start conversion programs is because they wanted to create a use case for older jets to motivate their customers to buy brand new passenger jets instead. So in the case of the 737-800, the newer equivalent would have been the 737 MAX 8. Now, I have already covered Boeing's 737 MAX production difficulties in a recent video, and these issues have slowed down the replacement and made the airlines want to hold on to the 737NGs for longer. And on top of that, the ramp up in demand for travel and the ensuing aircraft shortage is another reason why the airlines don't want to let go of their older planes anymore. And the lessors, by the way, who normally owns many of these planes, can now earn more by keeping the jets flying passengers than they would if they converted them into freighters. This change of attitude is really fascinating because as recently as a year ago, a lessor would simply schedule a 737 for freighter conversion as soon as its lease with an airline expired. And they would obviously do so because even if they didn't have a customer directly for the freighter, they knew that someone would snatch it up as soon as it became available. This just really shows how much of a roller coaster this industry has been during the last few years. Now, for many cargo pilots, this drop in demand for air freight and the decline in cargo rates will likely come with some really negative consequences. And unfortunately, this is also happening just as some of these cargo companies are in the process of renegotiating contracts with their pilot unions. In the United States, FedEx and its pilots have, for example, been working on this for quite a few months now, starting early in the summer. And for most of this time, FedEx pilots had hoped to benefit from the same record increases in contracts that pilots in United, Delta and American Airlines have been getting recently. Some of these passenger airliners have been offering pay increases to their pilots as high as 46% on top of other improvements in both terms and conditions. So in July, the FedEx pilots rejected a 30% pay increase, which likely felt like a smart move at the time. But that was before the first signs of the air cargo downturn began to appear. Now, officials at FedEx have instead encouraged many of the company's pilots to consider taking up an offer to transfer to American Airlines instead, showing just how dramatic this shift has been. Now, a move like that would actually make some logical sense, since passenger airlines in the US are facing a very real pilot shortage at the moment, so moving cargo pilots over to the passenger airlines would seem like the best of both worlds, wouldn't it? But as you might expect, it is not that simple. In order to switch over to American Airlines, these pilots would need to go to PSA, which is a regional subsidiary of American, where they would fly the CRJ 700s and 900s. Now, the US regionals have also recently increased the pay to their pilots, but such a move could represent a significant pay cut for many FedEx pilots, a far cry from the offered 30% pay increase that they were rejecting just a few months ago. PSA is right now offering FedEx pilots command positions and the chance to eventually being able to move over to mainland American Airlines, but this will likely not be an easy choice to make. We don't know all of the details of this deal and how it would work with American seniority list, for example, but the fact that these pilots would start in the regionals suggests that they'll be joining American at the very end of the queue. Now, PSA is also offering similar deals, actually more or less the same deals, to existing UPS pilots who might soon be facing the same issues as their colleagues at FedEx. Now, for younger pilots, such a switch may well be an appealing choice depending on other terms and conditions, but for many seasoned FedEx and UPS pilots, it will definitely be a very different story. Now, knowing how well the industry has been doing the last few years, this might all seem like lightning from a blue sky, but some sectors in the air cargo business were already struggling even before 2020. And that had to do a lot with another aspect of the air cargo business, which was already changing back then. You see, during the pandemic, we were all obviously shopping online like never before, but it's not like we had just discovered online shopping. No, E-commerce was a trend that started way before the pandemic did, and the cargo airlines were already well aware of it and the changes that this type of shopping was bringing to the industry. That is actually what takes us back to those refleeting efforts that had started years earlier. You see, those older jets that were now being replaced weren't bad just because they burned more fuel. E-commerce had also meant that many of these jets were suddenly the wrong size. With traditional freight operation, the amount of weight that an aircraft can carry tends to be more important than its internal volume. What this basically means was that these freighters would max out in terms of weight before all of their internal volume was taken up. So that's why, for example, Boeing used the shorter 777-200 as the basis for its factory-built 777 freighter rather than the slightly longer 777-300. Both variants would be able to carry similar amounts of weight in cargo, but the longer 300 would then just have a lot of dead volume inside, making the smaller 777-200 more efficient. Airbus made a very similar decision when it launched its factory-built freighter version of the Airbus A330. They went with the A330-200 instead of the 300, but both of these decisions were based on the assumption that cargo airlines care more about weight than volume. This used to be the correct assumption until e-commerce started to become the norm. The freighters now needed to carry a lot of lighter brown cardboard boxes instead of the traditional freight, meaning that volume suddenly becomes a limiting factor. That's why newer conversions of passenger jets to cargo roles tend to involve longer variants like the 777-300ER or the Airbus A330-300. And this is seriously reshuffling some old balances in the industry. Boeing had, for example, become really good at optimizing its cargo planes to work well for high cargo weights, but this new emphasis on volume could instead give Airbus an advantage here. And that's in an industry where Airbus previously didn't do nearly as well as Boeing did. Now obviously not all airlines are suddenly making the switch to carrying e-commerce packages only, so there is still plenty of demand for existing freighters. But newer restrictions on emissions, which will come in play in 2028, will mean that many of these airlines will still need to refresh their aircraft fleets anyway, if they didn't already do so during the last couple of years. Now, as I've mentioned before, aviation is a cyclic business with ebbs and flows. But in the long term, it has a clear growth tendency, with the industry bouncing back even after something as extreme as the 9/11 attacks or the COVID pandemic. So, despite these recent setbacks, both Boeing and Airbus see strong long-term demand for cargo aircraft, and those planes will need airlines and pilots to fly them. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments below and make sure that you have subscribed to the channel so you don't miss more content like this. Now, if you want to keep up to date with aviation news from all over the world, then go to app.mentorpilot.com and check out my latest articles, or go directly to mentorpilot.com. And if you want to support the work that my team and I do here on the channel, then please send a super thanks, maybe buy a t-shirt, or join my fantastic Patreon crew. We have Zoom hangouts now and then, and I would love to see you in my next one. Have an absolutely fantastic day, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.